Now let's check our understanding with 5 applied questions. 1. If a client reports intense anxiety but cannot identify what thought preceded it, what is the CBT therapist's next best step? A. Assign a dysfunctional thought record. B. Explore childhood origins of anxiety. C. Ask what went through their mind in that moment. D. Introduce exposure hierarchy. What's your answer? If you chose C, you are correct. Let's walk through why the way the EPPP thinks. The situation client reports intense anxiety but cannot identify the thought that preceded it. CBT works at the level of automatic thoughts first. If the thought is missing, the intervention cannot proceed. Why C is correct? Ask what went through their mind in that moment. That is step 2 in CBT sequencing. You cannot assign a DTR, the A, build an exposure hierarchy, D, or explore childhood origins, B, until the automatic thought is identified. CBT is structured and sequential. Why the other answers are wrong? A. Assign. DTR premature. The client cannot yet identify the thought. No data to record. B. Explore childhood origins. That leans psychodynamic, not first-line CBT. D. Introduce exposure hierarchy. That's behavioral intervention for avoidance, but you haven't clarified the cognition yet. Now let's level it up. 2. If the client can identify the thought but insists, it just feels true, I don't need evidence. What is the next best CBT move? A. Validate the emotion and move on. Begin Socratic questioning. C. Assign exposure therapy. D. Challenge the schema directly. Talk through your answer. If you chose B, then you are correct, again. The scenario client identifies the thought but says, it just feels true, I don't need evidence. That is emotional reasoning. The distortion is active. Now we ask, what does CBT do next? Why B is correct? Begin Socratic questioning. Socratic dialogue is the structured method used to examine evidence, test assumptions, explore alternative explanations, evaluate consequences of maintaining the belief. CBT does not immediately dismantle schemas. It works through guided questioning. That's collaborative empiricism. Why the others are wrong? A. Validate the emotion and move on. Validation is important, but stopping there reinforces the distortion. CBT does not end at validation. C. Assign exposure therapy. Exposure addresses avoidance behaviors. We are still working at the cognitive layer. D. Challenge the schema directly. Too deep, too fast. CBT typically works with automatic thoughts before restructuring core schemas. Sequence matters. Let's increase difficulty slightly. 3. A client completes a DTR. Their anxiety decreases from 85 out of 100 to 40 out of 100 after generating an alternative rational response. What mechanism explains the improvement? A. Insight into childhood origins. B. Behavioral reinforcement. C. Cognitive restructuring. D. Emotional catharsis. Walk through your reasoning again. If you answered C, you are on it and firing on all pistons. You little hot rod, you. The scenario client identifies automatic thought, generates alternative rational response. Anxiety drops from 85 to 40. What changed? The thought changed. When the thought changed, the emotional intensity decreased. That is the definition of cognitive restructuring. Why the other options fail? A. Insight into childhood origins. That's psychodynamic. No exploration of early developmental history occurred. B. Behavioral reinforcement. No behavior was reinforced. The change occurred before behavior changed. D. Emotional catharsis. There was no emotional release or processing. The mechanism was cognitive reappraisal. The principle demonstrated emotion intensity shifted because cognition shifted. That is the CBT model. Event to thought to emotion to behavior change the thought, shift the emotion. Now let's stress test your layering awareness. 4. If a vignette says the therapist and client work together to evaluate the evidence for the client's belief and generate alternative explanations, what key CBT concept is being demonstrated? A. Behavioral activation. B. Collaborative empiricism. C. Schema restructuring. D. Exposure hierarchy. Don't just answer. Reason why. Did you answer B? If you did, that's the correct answer. The vignette. The therapist and client work together to evaluate the evidence for the client's belief and generate alternative explanations. Key phrases: work together, evaluate evidence, generate alternative explanations. That language is textbook collaborative empiricism. It means therapist plus client equals co-investigators. Why B is correct. Collaborative empiricism is the therapeutic stance in CBT. It's not just questioning. It's the collaborative evaluation of evidence. Socratic dialogue is the technique. Collaborative empiricism is the relational framework. That distinction matters. Now, let's clean up the others. A. Behavioral activation. That's scheduling activities to increase reinforcement. No mention of activity change here. C. Schema restructuring. Too deep and too advanced for this description. The vignette describes examining a belief, not restructuring core schemas. D. Exposure hierarchy. That's gradual exposure to feared stimuli, completely different mechanism. Reinforcing what matters. High yield distinction. You must own Socratic dialogue equals the questioning method. Collaborative empiricism equals the investigative stance. Cognitive restructuring equals the process of changing the thought. DTR equals the structured tool used to implement it. Those four are related, but not identical. That's layering. Now let's push one level deeper. Pedal to the metal. If the vignette says, the therapist helps the client design an experiment to test whether their feared prediction actually occurs, what CBT technique is that? A. Decatastrophizing. B. Behavioral experiment. C. Exposure hierarchy. D. Guided imagery. Walk it through carefully. If you answered B, you burned rubber. B is the correct answer. The key phrase in the vignette: design an experiment to test whether their feared prediction actually occurs. The word experiment is not casual. In CBT, that is a behavioral experiment. Why is B the correct answer? A behavioral experiment is when a client has a prediction. The therapist helps them test it in real life. Data is gathered. The belief is evaluated afterward. It is evidence-based learning through action. An example: client belief: if I speak up in a meeting, everyone will think I'm stupid. Behavioral experiment: client intentionally speaks once in a meeting and records what actually happens. Prediction tested, data gathered, belief reevaluated. That's classic CBT. Why the other answers are wrong. A. Decatastrophizing. That is cognitive questioning. What's the worst that could happen? What's the likelihood? It happens verbally. No real-world test required. C. Exposure hierarchy. That's a gradual exposure to feared stimuli. It reduces avoidance through habituation. Behavioral experiments test beliefs. Exposure reduces anxiety. They overlap but are not identical. D. Guided imagery used for relaxation or rehearsal, not real-world testing of predictions. Here's a bonus question. Let me stretch you one last time. If a client believes, if I don't get this promotion, my life is ruined, and the therapist asks, what is the worst realistic outcome and how would you cope? What technique is that? A. Behavioral experiment. B. Decatastrophizing. C. Schema modification. D. Emotional processing. Take your time. Did you answer B? That's because you are on fire. B is the correct answer. The client's belief. If I don't get this promotion, my life is ruined. That's catastrophic thinking. The therapist asks, what is the worst realistic outcome? How would you cope? That is classic decatastrophizing. What decatastrophizing does? It examines the feared outcome, evaluates its probability, assesses coping ability, reduces exaggeration. It stays at the cognitive layer, no behavioral test, no exposure, no schema restructuring, just scaling down the catastrophic prediction. Why the others are wrong, A. Behavioral experiment would require testing the belief in action. C. Schema modification, too deep and global for this moment. D. Emotional processing. More experiential, not structured, cognitive examination. That concludes our cognitive behavioral therapy series for the EPPP. We've explored schemas, automatic thoughts, cognitive distortions, the dysfunctional thought record, and the structured order of CBT interventions as they appear in exam vignettes. Remember, success on the EPPP is not about memorizing isolated definitions. It's about recognizing layers, identifying mechanisms, and sequencing interventions correctly. If you can identify the level of cognition being targeted and the structure of the intervention, you are thinking like the exam. Take time to review, revisit the questions, and strengthen your reasoning. Now, we move forward.